He thought he'd win in court, but my evidence turned the whole trial upside down. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning. It was thin, almost deceptively so, as if the contents were insignificant. But the return address on the envelope hit like a punch, the law office representing her ex-husband, Gregory. As she sat at her small kitchen table, clutching a chipped mug of black coffee, her hands trembled. With a reluctant sigh, she tore it open and began reading. Petition for modification of divorce decree. Her heart sank. Gregory was dragging her back to court, again. It had been 2 years since their divorce, and she had clawed her way into a modest but peaceful life. Now, all of that was threatened. She read through the papers slowly, disbelief growing with every word. Gregory was not only seeking to terminate the small alimony she received, barely enough to cover rent, but also demanding full custody of their daughter, Ava. The nerve of it left her dizzy. Gregory had always been skilled at rewriting reality. During their marriage, he had made sure everyone saw him as the charming, successful husband, while she withered in the shadows, taking care of their home, their child, and suppressing her own dreams. Now, he was taking that same narrative to court. And this time, he was out for blood. Their marriage had begun with the kind of sparkle that made friends envious. Gregory was articulate, confident, and wore his ambition like a tailored suit. She, on the other hand, was soft-spoken and cautious, drawn to his magnetism like a moth to flame. In the beginning, his attention made her feel seen, chosen. But once the honeymoon glow faded, so did his warmth. He began correcting her in public, mocking her ideas with a smile that disguised contempt. At home, his voice turned sharp, and silence became her strategy for survival. It was never physical, he made sure of that. Gregory was too smart for anything that left a mark. Instead, he wounded with words and gaslighted her so effectively that she started doubting her own memory. He told her she was too sensitive, too emotional, too slow to understand him. And when Ava was born, his control deepened. He dismissed her parenting instincts and gradually made decisions unilaterally, pushing her into the role of unpaid nanny while he continued his rise through the ranks at his firm. By the time she filed for divorce, her self-esteem was in ruins, and her bank account wasn't much better. When she arrived at her attorney's office, the look on his face told her everything. He was young, kind, and generally optimistic, but even he seemed shaken after reading Gregory's motion. "He's painting you as unstable," he said carefully, placing the papers on the table between them. "He claims you've been alienating Ava, and that your current living situation is inadequate." Her cheeks flushed with shame. Her apartment wasn't fancy, but it was safe, clean, and filled with love. Yet Gregory had always been able to spin dust into diamonds, or diamonds into dust, depending on what served him. What hurt most wasn't just the lies, but how believable they would sound coming from Gregory. He knew how to perform concern, how to lace his cruelty in compassion. "I'm just worried about Ava's development," he would say with that concerned frown of his. And the court would nod along. Her attorney mentioned that Gregory had already brought in a child psychologist, someone she had never met, to evaluate Ava's behavioral regression. The trap had been set long before she even received the letter. This wasn't just about money or custody. This was Gregory's attempt to erase her entirely. The courthouse loomed, tall and gray, against a sky that seemed equally heavy. She clutched her coat tightly, her palms already damp. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet tension. Her name was called, and she entered the courtroom where Gregory was already seated. He stood and offered a polite smile, just for show, before returning to his seat beside his attorney, a sharp woman with ice-cold eyes and a voice that cut like glass. Her own attorney nodded encouragingly, but she could see the worry beneath his professionalism. As the hearing began, Gregory spoke with measured words, feigning sadness as he detailed Ava's supposed struggles. He referred to her as my daughter instead of our daughter. His tone was calm, almost gentle, but every word dug into her like a blade. He said he feared for Ava's future, citing her emotional instability, and implied that her mother's influence was the root cause. Sitting there, listening to the man who once held her through the birth of their daughter now describe her as unfit, something cracked inside her. And when she was finally asked to respond, her voice wavered, and the judge raised an eyebrow, making a note. The humiliation was complete. Back home, she sat on the edge of the couch staring at nothing. The silence of the apartment, once comforting, now felt suffocating. The hearing had gone worse than she expected. Gregory's legal team had come prepared with documents and expert opinions, while hers felt outpaced, underfunded, and overwhelmed. "It's just the first hearing," her attorney tried to reassure her. "We'll build a case. Don't lose hope yet." But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and she couldn't ignore how easily the court had leaned toward Gregory's narrative. She spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by every moment she hadn't spoken up, every time she'd accepted his cruelty in silence during their marriage. Maybe if she had fought more then, she wouldn't be fighting now. Her mind raced through memories of Ava, her bedtime giggles, her drawings on the fridge, the way she whispered "Mommy, I love you" before drifting to sleep. She couldn't lose her. But hope was a fragile thing, and it was flickering in the darkness. If Gregory won, it wouldn't just be the end of the case. It would be the erasure of everything she had survived for. Late one night, she sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, sorting through a faded box of memories. Inside were photos from their wedding, old letters, and receipts she once thought unimportant. At the bottom was a folded note Gregory had left years ago, after one of their worst arguments. "You'll never be anything without me," it read. Back then, she had crumpled it in anger, then kept it, perhaps as a quiet promise to herself that she would someday prove him wrong. Now, she opened it again, and the words still burned, but differently. They sparked not pain, but resolve. She remembered the day he accused her of being incapable of handling finances, forcing her to give up access to their bank account. He claimed it was for her own good, that she was too emotional to manage money. But she had once been the one who kept their budget balanced, who clipped coupons, paid bills, and covered for Gregory's expensive whims. That memory alone made her sit up straighter. She hadn't imagined it, she had lived it. For years, she had handed him control piece by piece, and now he was trying to take the last piece left, Ava. There was no shortage of moments she had swallowed, no end to the sacrifices she had made in the name of keeping peace. Like the birthdays where Gregory forgot to show up, or the parent-teacher nights he dismissed as unimportant. She had smiled through it all for Ava's sake, shielding their daughter from the coldness that simmered behind his practiced smile. Her suffering had never looked dramatic enough to be called abuse, and that was the danger, how invisible it all seemed. But inside, she had withered, every unspoken insult becoming a brick on her chest. She remembered once, years ago, waking up to find he'd booked a solo weekend trip without even telling her. She was left scrambling with Ava, who had a high fever that weekend. When she confronted him, he laughed, saying, "You're her mother, that's your job." That night, she cried in the shower so Ava wouldn't hear. And even now, as she stared out her window into the dark street below, she wondered if anyone would believe such moments mattered. But deep inside, she knew they did. The erosion hadn't happened in one big wave, it was the slow, quiet tide that had washed her identity away. At the next hearing, Gregory's lawyer introduced two new witnesses, his coworker and a neighbor from his luxury condo. Both claimed she had been erratic and emotionally unstable after the divorce. The coworker swore Gregory had to leave work often to handle crises caused by her unpredictability. The neighbor insisted she had once seen her yelling on the phone in the parking lot. Never mind that the call had been with a medical billing office that had mischarged her for Ava's clinic visit. The details didn't matter, only how the story was shaped. She sat there, feeling the courtroom grow heavier with every accusation. The judge's eyes occasionally flicked toward her, unreadable. Her stomach churned, her hands clenched beneath the table. Her attorney tried to object, to reframe, but the damage had been done. The murmurs among the audience, the raised eyebrows, it all stacked against her. And when Gregory leaned over to whisper smugly to his lawyer, her blood ran cold. He had planned this character assassination with surgical precision, knowing that perceptions, especially those dressed in expensive suits and polite tones, carried more weight than truth. By the third court appearance, she could no longer tell if time was on her side or against her. The judge, a composed woman in her 50s, seemed to be weighing the arguments carefully, but there were fleeting moments, slight sighs, tight-lipped expressions, that suggested the balance was tilting. Every time Gregory took the stand, his demeanor was polished. He would glance at the judge respectfully, lower his voice to convey calmness, and pause just long enough to seem thoughtful. He was playing the part to perfection, and it was working. When it was her turn, her nerves often betrayed her. Her voice cracked. Her eyes filled with tears at all the wrong moments. Once, she forgot a key date and was met with a long silence from the judge. Her attorney had warned her, emotions were valid, but in court, control was power. She left that day with a crushing sense of defeat. Gregory had spent years manipulating her into doubting herself. Now, it seemed the court was starting to believe the same story. As she stood in the courthouse hallway alone, she realized he wasn't just winning the legal battle. He was erasing her. That evening, back in her apartment, she finally broke down. Ava was staying with her grandmother for the weekend, and for the first time in weeks, the silence around her was total. She collapsed to the floor in the middle of the kitchen, sobbing into her arms. The weight of humiliation, fear, and helplessness crushed her like a wave. All the strength she had tried to gather, every bit of composure she forced for the sake of the hearings, came undone. She whispered into the empty air, "What if he takes her? What if no one sees the truth?" After hours, she pulled herself to her feet and stumbled into Ava's room. The drawings still taped to the walls, the tiny shoes by the door, the bedtime books she read over and over, it all reminded her why she couldn't give up. She was tired of being quiet. Tired of letting Gregory define her worth. For the first time in years, she felt something stir in her chest. Not fear. Not sadness. But something closer to fire. Whatever it took, she would fight back. Not just in court, but for her story to be heard. It was Sunday afternoon when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone and nearly ignored it. But when she opened the door, there stood a familiar figure, Maya, an old college friend she hadn't seen in years. Maya looked the same, confident, sharp, and kind-eyed. "I saw a clip online," she said softly, stepping inside. "Someone recorded part of your hearing. It's been circulating in a legal forum. I recognized you immediately." Shame flushed her cheeks, but Maya didn't judge. Instead, she reached for her hand. "I can help. I work for a family law firm now. I've seen too many women lose to men like him." They sat for hours, talking. Maya asked about everything, her marriage, the divorce, Ava. With every answer, her friend's brows furrowed further. He's built a case based on emotional manipulation. But that means there's a pattern. And if there's a pattern, there's proof somewhere. Old emails, texts, voicemails. The thought made her heart race. She hadn't touched anything from the marriage in years. The idea of reliving those moments terrified her. But Maya's voice was steady. Sometimes, we keep the most important evidence without even realizing it. Let's find it. They started in the closet, pulling out boxes she had shoved to the back after the divorce. Dust coated the lids, but inside were fragments of a life she had tried hard to forget. One box held her old laptop, slow, outdated, and cracked at the hinge. She hadn't used it since before Ava started school. With a deep breath, she plugged it in and waited as it struggled to come alive. Maya watched silently, allowing her space. As the screen finally blinked awake, a wave of old desktop icons greeted her, untouched for years. Within moments, they found folders labeled with dates. Some contained budgets, others vacation itineraries, some random photos. But then came the jackpot: email drafts, saved notes, voice memos. There were recordings of fights, written reflections she had typed and forgotten, even photos of bruises she had once convinced herself were clumsy mistakes. Her hands trembled as she opened a note dated 4 years ago. It detailed an argument where Gregory had taken her car keys and phone, locking her in the house for hours. She had written everything down that night. The proof was there, just waiting to be remembered. Maya's fingers flew across the keyboard, organizing everything. This isn't just helpful. It's powerful, she murmured. This shows control, coercion, patterns of intimidation. She attached labels, dates, timelines, and began building what she called a coercive behavior narrative. With each document, the fog that had dulled her memory began to lift. She started to see things clearly, not as isolated incidents, but as parts of a deliberate strategy Gregory had used to control her. Then came a folder marked security. She had forgotten it existed. Inside were screenshots from a shared home automation app they once used, door logs, camera history, system alerts. It showed that Gregory had remotely locked her out more than once, even when Ava was with her. "This is gold," Maya whispered. It proves his controlling behavior wasn't emotional only, it was physical and electronic too. Courts are just beginning to understand the depth of this kind of abuse. But with this, we might have a game changer. For the first time, she felt something warm pulse in her chest. Possibility. Maya offered to bring the materials to her firm's lead attorney, but there was a catch. Her current lawyer, Robert, had been supportive but passive, hesitant to push harder against Gregory's aggressive legal team. "He's not a bad lawyer," Maya admitted, "but this case needs someone who fights differently." The dilemma weighed on her. Robert had been there from the start, and replacing him would seem ungrateful, but the stakes were too high for loyalty alone. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with both legal folders open, comparing tone, strategy, energy. The contrast was glaring. The decision came the next morning. She called Robert and explained with gratitude but firmness that she was moving to a new firm. His response was brief, a quiet sigh followed by a polite "I understand." There was no bitterness, only resignation. It hurt, but she knew she had to choose the future over comfort. Maya introduced her to Karen Sue, a senior litigator with 20 years in family law. The woman radiated calm authority and listened without interruption. When the meeting ended, Karen looked at her squarely and said, "We're not just going to respond. We're going to take back the narrative. Working with Karen and Maya reignited a fire she hadn't felt in years. Every day, they reviewed the timeline, prepared responses, and compiled evidence. But more than that, they helped her reframe the story. You weren't unstable, Karen told her. You were surviving inside a system designed to erase your voice. But now, we're going to amplify it. The words echoed inside her, louder each time. And gradually, her posture changed. Her voice steadied. She began to remember who she had been before Gregory convinced her otherwise. There were still bad days, nights where doubt returned like an old ache. But they were fewer now, easier to silence. She started journaling again, not as evidence, but for herself. She bought Ava a new storybook and made it a ritual to read aloud every evening, no matter how tired she was. The upcoming hearing loomed, but for the first time, she wasn't dreading it. This time, she had more than just hope. She had truth, support, and a growing certainty that Gregory had underestimated her resolve. The woman who had once cried in silence was gone. What remained was someone no courtroom could ignore. The day she officially stood in court with Karen by her side, the energy in the room shifted. Gregory's smugness faltered for the first time. Karen's presence was commanding, her voice calm but precise, her words sharp as glass. She didn't waste time with theatrics. She presented the court with a detailed preliminary brief that included select pieces of the evidence they had compiled. The judge took note. Gregory's lawyer, who had grown used to controlling the pace, looked visibly unsettled. And when the judge agreed to admit digital records from their old security app into evidence, a subtle panic crept into Gregory's eyes. Outside the courtroom, Gregory approached her, his tone deceptively casual. "New lawyer, huh? Must have cost you," he muttered, flashing a tight smile. She looked him in the eye for the first time in years. "Not as much as it'll cost you," she said quietly, then walked away. For once, he didn't have a comeback. That evening, she and Karen celebrated the small win over coffee. "This is just the beginning," Karen reminded her. But it was a very good day. Karen suggested they subpoena Gregory's old phone records, emails, and financial documents. It wasn't just about proving manipulation, it was about showing a pattern. As they combed through the materials, one particular email thread surfaced. It was a conversation between Gregory and his colleague, sent just weeks before the custody filing. In it, Gregory wrote, "Once I get Ava, I won't have to deal with child support anymore. She can cry to her friends, but she won't touch a cent of my money." The tone was casual, almost mocking. But it was damning. Karen leaned back in her chair, lips pressed into a thin line. "This is what we call motive." The email showed that his actions weren't motivated by concern for Ava, but financial convenience and control. It dismantled the concerned father facade he had so carefully built. They decided to hold it for a strategic reveal in court. "He's been hiding behind politeness," Maya said. "Let's see how polite he stays when this comes out." At the next hearing, Gregory's lawyer pushed for an emergency motion to limit her visitation, citing alleged emotional instability again. Karen stood calmly and countered with not only eyewitness testimonies, neighbors, teachers, and even Ava's pediatrician, but also a written statement from Ava's school counselor affirming that Ava was thriving at her mother's home. The judge, reviewing the files with careful attention, frowned slightly and asked, "Why was none of this brought forward earlier?" Karen replied simply, "Because until now, my client didn't have someone willing to fight for her." Gregory visibly tensed as the judge denied the emergency motion and scheduled a full review of both households. It was the first major win, and it felt seismic. As they exited the courtroom, she exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. She looked at Karen, who gave her a small, approving nod. "He's losing ground," Karen said. "And he knows it." That night, she let herself cry, but this time, not from fear. This time, it was relief. As soon as Gregory realized he was losing control, he reverted to old habits. Anonymous calls were made to her landlord about disturbances in the apartment. One afternoon, Ava's school reported a strange man asking questions about her schedule. Karen immediately filed a restraining order, which the judge approved on an emergency basis. But the fear returned like a storm, loud, chaotic, and intrusive. She double-checked every lock, installed a new camera outside the apartment, and walked Ava to school herself. Despite the tension, she refused to show weakness. She kept the restraining order documents in her purse at all times and notified the school and daycare staff. "He's trying to provoke you," Maya warned. "But you're not who you were. You're not going to break." And she didn't. Each attempt Gregory made to intimidate her only strengthened her resolve. He could rattle her nerves, but he could no longer control her story. The day the trial resumed, the courtroom was packed. Friends, legal observers, even a few strangers who had seen her story online came to watch. Gregory walked in wearing a dark blue suit, confident as ever, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Karen began the day by submitting a request to admit new evidence, the email where Gregory described custody as a way to avoid financial obligation. The judge accepted it. Silence followed as the document was read aloud. Gregory's face shifted, subtle, but undeniable. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge shut it down. "This court takes manipulation of custody cases seriously," she said firmly. The entire tone of the trial changed. The audience, once unsure, now watched with quiet intensity. She sat straighter in her chair, hands folded in her lap. For the first time since this nightmare began, she no longer felt like she was merely surviving the storm. She was standing in it, unshaken. Karen stood and requested permission to play a short audio clip, one that had been pulled from the voice memos buried in the old laptop. It was a recording of an argument in their living room, one where Gregory's voice was sharp and unmistakable. "If you ever think about leaving, just remember, no one will believe you." The courtroom fell silent. Gregory's face froze. The judge narrowed her eyes and motioned for the audio to continue. The clip ended with the sound of her crying, faint but unmistakable. The judge turned to Karen and said, "Submit the transcript as part of the permanent record." After the playback, Gregory's lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but he didn't respond. His posture had shifted, no longer relaxed or smug, but defensive. The audio had pierced the veil he had so carefully crafted. Karen didn't gloat. She simply laid out the timeline, the emails, the logs, each one a thread in a carefully woven tapestry of control. The judge listened, her demeanor now markedly different from the early hearings. She was no longer skeptical, she was attentive. When Gregory was called to the stand, he entered with a stiffness that betrayed his nerves. His lawyer instructed him to remain calm, but the cracks were already forming. Karen stood to cross-examine him, and her approach was quiet but relentless. She began by referencing his concern for Ava's well-being. "You stated under oath that your only motivation is your daughter's best interest, correct?" He nodded. Karen then pulled up the infamous email. "Then why, Mr. Hale, did you refer to your daughter as a financial escape plan?" Gregory hesitated, tried to spin it as sarcasm, but the damage was done. Karen continued, calmly walking him through inconsistencies in his testimonies, dates that didn't align, emergencies that were proven false, exaggerated accounts of instability that had been contradicted by professionals. As she pressed further, Gregory grew flustered. His voice rose. At one point, he snapped, "She's manipulating everyone." Karen paused, letting the outburst hang in the air. The courtroom felt frozen. "Let the record show," she said calmly, that the defendant raised his voice while under oath. The judge made a quiet note, and Gregory, realizing his misstep, fell silent. The final witness Karen called was unexpected. A woman in her late 30s, professionally dressed, took the stand. It was Melissa, Gregory's former assistant. She looked nervous but determined. "I worked closely with Mr. Hale for over 5 years," she began. "I was present when he planned the custody case. He said she wouldn't be able to fight back, not with her income. He told me, word for word, she'll fold like paper in court." The gasp in the room was audible. Gregory's face turned pale. He looked at Melissa in disbelief, his mouth slightly open. Melissa continued, explaining how Gregory had coached witnesses and created false documentation. "He used to brag about how easy it was to manipulate the narrative," she added. "He said courts would always believe the man in a suit over the woman in tears." Karen thanked her and rested her case. The judge looked stunned. Gregory's lawyer declined to cross-examine. The silence in the courtroom now was heavy, not with doubt, but with realization. For the first time, the entire courtroom saw Gregory without the mask. The judge called for a recess. She remained seated for a moment after everyone else had risen, her expression unreadable. In chambers, she reviewed the transcripts and exhibits in silence. Every claim Gregory had made now stood on shaky ground. Every attempt to discredit the mother had unraveled under scrutiny. When court resumed, her tone was different. "This court has heard compelling evidence of coercive control, misrepresentation, and intent to deceive. The allegations made against the mother are not only unsupported, they appear to be part of a calculated effort to remove her from her daughter's life." As the judge spoke, tears welled up in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from something like justice. Gregory sat stiffly, no longer confident, his gaze fixed on the floor. The courtroom, once skeptical of her, now watched in stunned silence. Karen gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is your truth. And it's finally being seen." She nodded, still absorbing it. After so long being silenced, her voice had found resonance in the one place she feared most. By the end of the day, the hearing had spread across legal blogs and advocacy groups. The recording, the assistant's testimony, and the judge's comments had made an impression. A mother, once ridiculed and dismissed, had stood tall and exposed the underbelly of a manipulative custody battle. Online forums lit up with support. People who had gone through similar experiences reached out. "Thank you for not backing down," one message read. "You gave me the courage to keep fighting." She read each one slowly, her hands shaking. It felt surreal. Outside the courthouse, a few reporters waited. She didn't speak to them, only held Ava's hand tightly as they walked to the car. Ava looked up at her and asked, "Mommy, why was everyone looking at you like that?" She paused, smiled gently, and replied, "Because they're finally listening, sweetheart." That night, as she tucked Ava into bed, she felt something deep and unshakable. She had not only reclaimed her voice, but had opened a path for others who still felt invisible. The courtroom was silent as Karen stood to deliver her closing remarks. She didn't raise her voice or dramatize her sua fala. Em vez disso, ela se concentra na verdade. This case is not just about custody, she began. It's about power. It's about a man who believed he could distort reality and silence a mother's voice with strategy and status. But the truth has spoken louder than the lies. She walked slowly across the floor, pausing before the judge. My client has not only endured. She has protected, nurtured, and sacrificed for her child, even in the darkest of circumstances. That is what real parenting looks like. When Gregory's lawyer stood, her tone was no longer assured. She spoke briefly, reiterating that her client was acting in the best interest of his daughter, but the words rang hollow. There was no conviction in her voice, only formality. Gregory didn't look up once. He kept his eyes down as if avoiding his own reflection. And when the judge signaled that the hearing was concluded and she would deliver the ruling the next morning, the energy in the room was unmistakable. The narrative had changed. Everyone knew it. The courtroom was full when the judge returned to deliver her verdict. She entered with a composed expression, her hands steady as she took her seat. After careful review of the evidence, testimonies, and overall conduct of both parties, she began, "This court has reached a decision." A long pause followed, the kind that makes time feel suspended. Primary custody will remain with the mother. The father's visitation schedule will be revised and restricted until further review. A murmur passed through the audience. Gregory's mouth parted slightly, but he said nothing. It was over. But the judge continued. This court also finds that multiple attempts were made to manipulate the legal process and misrepresent the mother's character. These actions are deeply troubling. Her voice grew firmer. As such, the court advises the State Bar to review this case and determine whether further legal or disciplinary action is warranted. That final blow landed heavier than any scream could. Gregory's world, so carefully constructed on arrogance and manipulation, was crumbling in public view. And at the center of it all stood the woman he once underestimated, unbroken. News of the ruling spread quickly. In the weeks that followed, Gregory's firm distanced itself from him, releasing a statement that cited a need for integrity and leadership. He was asked to take an indefinite leave. Rumors swirled that he had been passed over for a major promotion. At Ava's school, teachers offered quiet nods of support. Other parents, ones who had once kept their distance, began greeting her warmly. The whispers had turned to words. Silence had become solidarity. Still, she didn't celebrate his downfall. That wasn't the victory she needed. What mattered was waking up each morning knowing Ava was safe, knowing she had stood up and been heard. Life returned to its rhythm, school lunches, homework checks, bedtime stories, but everything felt different. Lighter. Stronger. She caught herself smiling more often. Not because things were perfect, but because she had faced the storm and made it through. Several months later, she sat by the window in a cozy cafe, sipping tea while Ava scribbled in a sketchbook beside her. Across from her sat Karen, now a close friend. They were talking about a new job offer she had just received, working at a nonprofit that supported women navigating family court battles. "I want to help someone like me," she said softly. Karen smiled. "You already have." She looked around the cafe, the people, the quiet warmth. It was hard to believe how far she had come. Later that week, she spoke at a local community center. Her voice no longer trembled. She told her story not as a victim, but as a woman who had reclaimed her voice. "I used to think strength meant staying silent. Now I know it means being heard. The room was quiet as she finished. A woman in the back, eyes brimming, stood and clapped. Then another. Then all of them. She stood there, not needing applause, but feeling something even better, peace. One crisp morning, a letter arrived at her door. It was from the judge. Not a formal notice, but a handwritten message. Thank you for your courage. Your case reminded me why this bench matters. She held the letter in both hands, overwhelmed by the weight of quiet validation. That afternoon, she and Ava went to the park. They laughed under the amber trees, chased by the wind, free in a way they hadn't been in years. The world hadn't changed, but she had. And as she watched Ava twirl under the autumn sky, she knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new story, one no longer written by fear or shame. A story defined not by what was taken, but by what was reclaimed. Her voice. Her strength. Her life. She had once stood alone in a courtroom, her truth trembling against the weight of lies. Now, she walked forward knowing the truth, when spoken with courage, could change everything.